So, we talk about trauma mostly when something is happening. And when we think about intergenerational trauma, sometimes we don't pay attention to the fact that we are born into family systems that have trauma. And so, if our parents, if our grandparents experienced something, there might not have been the work done within those generations, and it might be something that then trickles down to us as children, and or something that we pass on to our own children. And so just recognizing that just because it happened in the past to someone different in our family doesn't mean that it doesn't still have an impact on our family. Yeah, it becomes part of our DNA because our experiences shape who we are. And so we may not understand why things are happening the way that they are in our family. We may not understand some of the system stuff that's going on. And when we dig in a little bit deeper to say, what was it like growing up in your household? When we're talking with our parents or when we're sharing experiences where we see maybe the reaction of a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, you start to kind of peel back some of the layers. And it doesn't always happen in a way of, let's sit down, let's have this conversation. Sometimes it's the organic conversations where we have to be curious and lean in a little bit more. I know for me, I grew up with two parents who didn't grow up with dads. And that really shaped the way that my father showed up. And my mom would say, neither one of us had a dad, so this is a little bit different for us. Those are the kinds of conversations where we expect really high things from our family members. And sometimes there's either a barrier or things haven't been talked about or worked through. And so things look a little bit different. And we, as the children and as the next generation, have to be aware of that and figure out what it's going to look like next for us. Yeah, if you're someone who has grown up with trauma in the home, domestic violence, sexual assault, mental health issues, alcoholism, when we look at the experiences, they shape how our brains receive and process difficult situations. So, if you're someone who wasn't safe to go home every day after school, there is going to be cortisol and the way that your brain processes through hard, difficult situations different than someone who had, as I call it, like the beaver cleaver upbringing, where there was a parent home every day and there wasn't any what you would call large trauma within the family. And so our brains are trained over time to respond to danger. It's like that whole danger, Will Robinson, if home presents itself as danger all the time, then our brain is going to have sort of an adverse response when we're walking through that door. And if then you have children of your own, you may raise your children differently because your fear of being home may then be intrinsically passed on to your own children. And so it's really about looking at the way that trauma shows up in our systems and figuring out how, in this moment of intergenerational trauma, what we're really talking about here is breaking that cycle so that it doesn't continue on and be passed down to more generations. When we think about families who are dealing with really tough stuff, whether it is the loss of someone by suicide, maybe there's been a murder in the family, maybe a parent is incarcerated. Again, these aren't conversations where you're going to sit down and do, tell me about where it all began. This is conversations of being able to say, like, I want to do better. And reaching out and getting the resources and having the conversations with qualified experts who can help shift that trajectory. Sometimes I think that when we see difficult things happening in families or we see children that are really struggling, there is a tendency at times to say, like, well, that's just how it is in that family. But that's not how it always has to be. That's not how we have to continue to show up. And we have to recognize that it might take time. And there might be some families that move through it quickly, and there might be some families where it takes more time and more conversations and more awareness. Children have a resilience that is different than what adults sometimes bring to the table. And so being able to address what's happening in a home and being able to address that trauma, we talk about adverse childhood experiences. So we know that when a child goes through something where there is an adverse experience, whether it be substance abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, mental health illness within the home, if that isn't addressed, that's when we see children having a higher probability that they'll have additional mental health concerns and or needs, and physical needs will look different when you're an adult. So you have to think about how to have those conversations in an age appropriate way. You know, you might have a different conversation with a 6-year-old than you would a 16-year-old, but absolutely we can be having these conversations. And sometimes it's just about naming it and acknowledging it and making sure that we're putting in place some of these stopgaps for our children where we can say, it's okay, you're safe here. And if that conversation can't happen at home, maybe it happens at school. Maybe it happens at the local religious facility. Maybe it's happening with a therapist or a coach. You know, anywhere that we are interacting with children, we can be having these conversations to help kids sort of put the story around what's happening. Because in the absence of information and data, children are going to make up their own stories. And so we want to lead with information and helping them to process through whatever's going on. Yeah, you know, so we're going to be bringing Dr. Marielle Bouquet to the area. She's going to be with us on October 29th at 6:30 at the Todd Performing Arts Center at Chesapeake College campus. And Dr. Bouquet wrote a New York Times best-selling book called Break the Cycle. And it is really about showing up in ways and identifying skills and tools and tasks that we can be putting in place so that we can have our generations that are coming after trauma look different. And it's really about kind of acknowledging and breaking down some of this information. Dr. Bouquet she's a psychologist. She received her doctorate at Columbia University. She's internationally known, nationally known. I was sharing with you that, you know, I found her by watching the Today Show and just reached out and said, you know, so often I have conversations in the community about our ACEs and the adverse childhood experiences and helping people understand what they are. But folks will often say to me, okay, well, what's next? Like, once I know that I am on the ACEs scale, what do I do? This is kind of that second half. She's really digging into when we know that we've experienced adversity as children, when we know that our family systems have trauma, this is now about the answer of what do I do, and some of the solutions that we need to be able to do exactly what the title of her book says, which is break the cycle. She herself identifies as an African-American Latinx woman, and she talks a little bit about how we see this show up in different family systems. And so we recognize that, you know, how it shows up in our African-American community versus the white community versus the Latin community, it may look different in all of our cultures, but trauma is trauma. And the way that we can respond to trauma looks similar in terms of skills and conversation starters. And so we really hope that this is going to be something that's going to open the eyes of folks in the community, because we all have a role to play in helping to break this trauma cycle. And the awareness and just having an understanding of how trauma shows up can help us in all of our interactions. You know, when kids are not presenting at their best, when adults are struggling and maybe not showing up as their best, this gives us some insight. And remembering that we don't know what folks are bringing to the table. You know, there's not a billboard that you hang around your neck that says, here's all the things I've experienced. So it's a way to sort of give ourselves some of that information so that we can show up differently as community members, friends, and family members to say, maybe there's something more happening here, and giving a better understanding.